Hello, and welcome back to Baby Alice's Stories. We now continue with The Glass Castle by Jeannette Walls. Part 4 of Chapter 2, The Desert. At twilight, once the sun had slid behind the Palin Mountains, the bats came out and swirled through the sky above the shacks of Midland. The old lady who lived next door warned us away from bats. She called them flying rats and said one got caught in her hair once and went crazy, clawing at her scalp. But I loved those ugly little bats, the way they dart past, their wings in a furious blur. Dad explained how they had sonar detectors, kind of like the ones in nuclear submarines. Brian and I would throw pebbles, hoping the bats would think they were bugs and eat them, and the weight of the pebbles would pull them down and we could keep them as pets, tying a long string to their claw so they could still fly around. I wanted to train one to hang upside down from my finger, but those darn bats were too clever to fall for our trick. The bats were out, swooping and screeching when we left Midland for Blythe. Earlier that day, Mom had told us that the baby had decided it was big enough to come out soon and join the family. Once we were on the road, Dad and Mom got in a big fight over how many months she'd been pregnant. Mom said she was 10 months pregnant. Dad, who had fixed someone's transmission earlier that day and used the money he'd made to buy a bottle of tequila, said she probably lost track somewhere. I always carry children longer than most women, Mom said. Lori was in my womb for 14 months. Bullshit, Dad said. Unless Lori's part elephant. Don't you make fun of me or my children, Mom yelled. Some babies are premature. Mine were all post-mature. That's why they're so smart. Their brains had longer to develop. Dad said something about freaks of nature, and Mom called Dad a Mr. Know-It-All Smarty Pants, who refused to believe that she was special. Dad said something about Jesus H. Christ on a goddamn crutch, not taking that much time to gestate. Mom got upset at Dad's blasphemy, reached her foot over to the driver's side and stomped on the brake. It was the middle of the night, and Mom bolted out of the car and ran into the darkness. You crazy bitch, Dad hollered. Get your goddamn ass back in this car. You make me, Mr. Tough Guy, she screamed as she ran away. Dad jerked the steering wheel to one side and drove off the road into the desert after her. Lori, Brian, and I braced one another with our arms like we always did when Dad went on some wild chase that we knew would get bumpy. Dad stuck his head out the window as he drove, hollering at Mom, calling her a stupid whore and a stinking cunt, and ordered her to get back in the car. Mom refused. She was ahead of us, bobbing in and out of the desert brush. Since she never used curse words, she was calling Dad names like blankety blank and worthless drunk so-and-so. Dad stopped the car, then jammed down the accelerator and popped the clutch. We shot forward toward Mom, who screamed and jumped out of the way. Dad turned around and went for her again. It was a moonless night, so we couldn't see Mom except when she ran into the beam of the headlights. She kept looking over her shoulder. Her eyes were wide like a hunted animal's. We kids cried and begged Dad to stop, but he ignored us. I was even more worried about the baby inside Mom's swollen belly than I was about her. The car bounced on holes and rocks, brush scratching against its sides, and dust coming through the open windows. Finally, Dad cornered Mom against some rocks. I was afraid he might smush her with the car, but instead he got out and dragged her back, legs flailing. He threw her into the car. We banged back through the desert and onto the road. Everyone was quiet except Mom, who was sobbing that she really did carry Lori for 14 months. Mom and Dad made up the next day, and by late afternoon, Mom was cutting Dad's hair in the living room of the apartment we'd rented in Blythe. He'd taken off his shirt and was sitting backward on a chair with his head bowed and his hair combed forward. Mom was snipping away while Dad pointed out the parts that were still too long. When they were finished, Dad combed his hair back and announced that Mom had done a hell of a fine shearing job. Our apartment was in a one-story cinder block building on the outskirts of town. It had a big blue and white plastic sign in the shape of an oval and a boomerang that said, "The LBJ Apartments." I thought it stood for Lori, Brian, and Janet, but Mom said LBJ were the initials of the president, who, she added, was a crook and a warmonger. A few truck drivers and cowboys had rooms at the LBJ Apartments, but most of the other people who lived there were migrant workers and their families, and we heard them talking through the thin sheetrock walls. Mom said it was one of the bonuses of living at the LBJ Apartments because we'd be able to pick up a little Spanish without even studying. Blythe was in California, but the Arizona border was within spitting distance. People who lived there liked to say the town was 150 miles west of Phoenix, 250 miles east of Los Angeles, and smack dab in the middle of nowhere. But they always said it like they were bragging. Mom and Dad weren't exactly crazy about Blythe. Too civilized, they said, and downright unnatural too, since no town the size of Blythe had any business existing out in the Mojave Desert. It was near the Colorado River, founded back in the 19th century by some guy who figured he could get rich turning the desert into farmland. He dug a bunch of irrigation ditches that drained water out of the Colorado River to grow lettuce and grapes and broccoli right there in the middle of all the cactus and sagebrush. Dad got disgusted every time we drove past one of those farm fields with the irrigation ditches wide as moats. "It's a goddamn perversion of nature," he said. "If you want to live in the farmland, haul your sorry hide off to Pennsylvania. If you want to live in the desert, eat prickly pears, not iceberg pansy-ass lettuce." "That's right," Mom would say. "Prickly pears have more vitamins anyway." Living in a big city like Blythe meant I had to wear shoes. It also meant I had to go to school. School wasn't so bad. I was in the first grade, and my teacher, Miss Cook, always chose me to read aloud when the principal came into the classroom. The other students didn't like me very much because I was so tall and pale and skinny and always raised my hand too fast and waved it frantically in the air whenever Miss Cook asked a question. A few days after I started school, 4 Mexican girls followed me home and jumped me in an alleyway near the LBJ Apartments. They beat me up pretty bad, pulling my hair, tearing my clothes, and calling me a teacher's pet and a matchstick. I came home that night with scraped knees and elbows and a busted lip. "Looks to me like you got in a fight," Dad said. He was sitting at the table, taking apart an old alarm clock with Brian. "Just a little dust up," I said. That was the word Dad always used after he'd been in a fight. "How many were there?" "6, I lied. "Is that split lip okay?" he asked. "This little old scratch?" I asked. "You should have seen what I did to them." "That's my girl," Dad said, and went back to the clock. but Brian kept looking over at me. The next day when I got to the alley, the Mexican girls were waiting for me. Before they could attack, Brian jumped out from behind a clump of sagebrush, waving a yucca branch. Brian was shorter than me and just as skinny, with freckles across his nose and sandy red hair that fell into his eyes. He wore my hand-me-down pants, which I had inherited from Lori and then passed on to him, and they were always sliding off his bony behind. "Just back off now, and everyone can walk away with all their limbs still attached," Brian said. It was another one of Dad's lines. The Mexican girls stared at him before bursting into laughter. Then they surrounded him. Brian did fairly well, fending them off until the yucca branch broke. Then he disappeared beneath a flurry of swinging fists and kicking feet. I grabbed the biggest rock I could find and hit one of the girls on the head with it. From the jolt in my arm, I thought I'd cracked her skull. She sank to her knees. One of her friends pushed me to the ground and kicked me in the face. Then they all ran off. The girl I had hit, holding her head as she staggered along. Brian and I sat up. His face was covered with sand. All I could see were his blue eyes peering out and a couple of spots of blood seeping through. I wanted to hug him, but that would have been too weird. Brian stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We climbed through a hole in the chain-link fence he had discovered that morning and ran into the iceberg lettuce farm next to the apartment building. I followed him through the rows of big green leaves, and we eventually settled down to feast, burying our faces in the huge wet heads of lettuce and eating until our stomachs ached. "I guess we scared them off pretty good," I said to Brian. "I guess," he said. He never liked to brag, but I could tell he was proud that he had taken on 4 bigger, tougher kids, even if they were girls. "Lettuce war!" Brian shouted, and he tossed a half-eaten head at me like a grenade. We ran along the rows, pulling up heads and throwing them at each other. A crop duster flew overhead. We waved at it. We waved as it made a pass above the field. A cloud sprayed out from behind the plane, and a fine white powder came sprinkling down on our heads. 2 months after we moved to Blythe, when Mom said she was 12 months pregnant, she at last gave birth. After she'd been in the hospital for 2 days, we all drove out to pick her up. Dad left us kids waiting in the car with the engine idling while he went in for Mom. They came running out with Dad's arm around Mom's shoulder. Mom was cradling a bundle in her arms and giggling sort of guiltily like she'd stolen a candy bar from a dime store. I figured they had checked out Rex Walls style. "What is it?" Lori asked as we sped away. "Girl," Mom said. Mom handed me the baby. I was going to turn 6 in a few months, and Mom said I was mature enough to hold her the entire way home. The baby was pink and wrinkly, but absolutely beautiful, with big blue eyes, soft wisps of blonde hair, and the tiniest fingernails I had ever seen. She moved in confused, jerky motions. She moved in confused, jerky motions, as if she couldn't understand why Mom's belly wasn't still around her. I promised her I'd always take care of her. The baby went without a name for weeks. Mom said she wanted to study it first, the way she would the subject of painting. We had a lot of arguments over what the name should be. I wanted to call her Rosita, after the prettiest girl in my class, but Mom said that name was too Mexican. "I thought we weren't supposed to be prejudiced," I said. "It's not being prejudiced," Mom said. "It's a matter of accuracy in labeling." She told us that both our grandmothers were angry because neither Lori nor I had been named after them. So she decided to call the baby Lily Ruth Maureen. Lily was Mom's mother's name, and Irma Ruth was Dad's mother's name. But we'd call the baby Maureen, a name Mom liked because it was diminutive of Mary. So she'd always be naming the baby after herself, but pretty much no one would know it. That Dad told us would make everyone happy except his mom, who hated the name Ruth and wanted the baby called Irma, and Mom's mom, who would hate sharing her namesake with Dad's mom. A few months after Maureen was born, a squad car tried to pull us over because the brake lights on the green caboose weren't working. Dad took off. He said that if the cops stopped us, they'd find out that we had no registration or insurance and that the license plate had been taken off another car, and they'd arrest us all. After barreling down the highway, he made a screeching U-turn, with us kids feeling like the car was going to tumble over on its side. But the squad car made one too. Dad peeled through black at 100 miles an hour, ran a red light, cut the wrong way up one street, the other cars honking and pulling over. He made a few more turns, then headed down an alley and found an empty garage to hide in. We heard the sound of a siren a couple of blocks away, and then it faded. Dad said that since the Gestapo would have their eyes out for the green caboose, we'd have to leave it in the garage and walk home. The next day he announced that Blythe had become a little too hot, and we were hitting the road again. This time he knew where we were going. Dad had been doing some research and settled on a town in northern Nevada called Battle Mountain. There was gold in Battle Mountain, Dad said, and he intended to go after it with the prospector. Finally, we were going to strike it rich. Mom and Dad rented a great big U-Haul truck. Mom explained that since only she and Dad could fit in the front of the U-Haul, Lori, Brian, Maureen, and I were in for a treat. We got to ride in the back. It would be fun, she said, a real adventure, but there wouldn't be any lights, so we would have to use all our resources to entertain one another. Plus, we were not allowed to talk, since it was illegal to ride in the back. Anyone who heard us might call the cops. Mom told us the trip would be about 14 hours if we took the highway, but we should tack on another couple of hours because we might make some scenic detours. We packed up what furniture we had. There wasn't much, mostly parts of the prospector, and a couple of chairs and Mom's oil paintings and art supplies. When we were ready to leave, Mom wrapped Maureen in a lavender blanket and passed her to me, and we kids all climbed into the back of the U-Haul. Dad closed the doors. It was pitch black, and the air smelled stale and dusty. We were sitting on the ribbed wooden floor, on frayed, stained blankets used to wrap furniture, feeling for one another with our hands. "Here goes the adventure," I whispered. "Shh," Lori said. The U-Haul started up and lurched forward. Maureen let loose with a loud, high-pitched wail. I shushed her and rocked her and patted her, but she kept crying. So I gave her to Lori, who whispered sing-song into her ear and told jokes. That didn't work. That didn't work either, so we begged Maureen to please stop crying. Then we just put our hands over our ears. After a while, it got cold and uncomfortable in the back of the dark U-Haul. The engine made the floor vibrate, and we'd all go tumbling whenever we hit a bump. Several hours passed. By then, we were all dying to pee and wondering if Dad was going to pull over for a rest stop. Suddenly, with a bang, we hit a huge pothole, and the back doors on the U-Haul flew open. The wind shrieked through the compartment. We were afraid we were going to get sucked out, and we all shrank back against the prospector. The moon was out. We could see the glow from the U-Haul's tail lights and the road we'd come down, stretching back through the silvery desert. The unlocked doors swung back and forth with loud clangs. Since the furniture was stored between us in the cabin, we couldn't knock on the wall to get Mom's and Dad's attention. We banged on the sides of the U-Haul and hollered as loud as we could, but the engine was too noisy and they didn't hear us. Brian crawled to the back of the van. When one of the doors swung in, he grabbed at it, but it flew open again, jerking him forward. I thought the door was going to drag Brian out, but he jumped back just in time and scrambled along the wooden floor toward Laurie and me. Brian and Laurie held tight to the prospector, which Dad had tied securely with ropes. I was holding Maureen, who, for some strange reason, had stopped crying. I wedged myself into a corner. It seemed like we'd have to ride it out. Then a pair of headlights appeared way in the distance behind us. We watched as the car slowly caught up with the U-Haul. After a few minutes, it pulled up right behind us, and its headlights caught us there in the back of the cab. The car started honking and flashing its brights. Then it pulled up and passed us. The driver must have signaled Mom and Dad because the U-Haul slowed to a stop, and Dad came running back with a flashlight. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. He was furious. We tried to explain that it wasn't our fault the doors blew open, but he was still angry. I knew that he was scared too, maybe even more scared than angry. "Was that a cop?" Brian asked. "No," Dad said, "and you're sure as hell lucky it wasn't, or he'd be hauling your asses off to jail." After we peed, we climbed back into the truck and watched as Dad closed the doors. The darkness enveloped us again. We could hear Dad locking the doors and double-checking them. The engine restarted, and we continued on our way. Battle Mountain had started out as a mining post, settled 100 years earlier by people hoping to strike it rich. But if anyone ever had struck it rich in Battle Mountain, they must have moved somewhere else to spend their fortune. Nothing about the town was grand except the big empty sky, and off in the distance, the stony purple Tuscarora Mountains running down to the Table Flat Desert. The main street was wide, with sun-bleached cars and pickups parked at an angle to the curb, but only a few blocks long, flanked on both sides with low, flat-roofed buildings made of adobe or brick. A single streetlight flashed red day and night. A single streetlight flashed red day and night. Along Main Street was a grocery store, a drugstore, a Ford dealership, a Greyhound bus station, and two big casinos, the Owl Club and the Nevada Hotel. The buildings, which seemed puny under the huge sky, had neon signs that didn't look like they were on during the day because the sun was so bright. We moved into a wooden building on the edge of town that had once been a railroad depot. It was 2 stories tall, painted an industrial green, and was so close to the railroad tracks that you could wave to the engineer from the front window. Our new home was one of the oldest buildings in town, Mom proudly told us, with a real frontier quality to it. Mom and Dad's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, where the station manager once had his office. We kids slept downstairs in what had been the waiting room. The old restrooms were still there, but the toilet had been ripped out of one and a bathtub put in its place. The ticket booth had been converted into a kitchen. Some of the original benches were still bolted to the unpainted wood walls, and you could see the dark, worn spots where prospectors and miners and their wives and children had sat waiting for the train, their behinds polishing the wood. Since we didn't have any money for furniture, we improvised. A bunch of huge wooden spools, the kind that hold industrial cable, had been dumped on the side of the tracks, not far from my house, so we rolled them home and turned them into tables. What kind of fools would go waste money on store-bought tables when they can have these for free? Dad said as he pounded the tops of the spools to show us how sturdy they were. For chairs, we used some smaller spools and a few crates. Instead of beds, we kids each slept in a big cardboard box like the ones refrigerators get delivered in. A little while after we'd move into the depot, we heard Mom and Dad talking about buying us kids real beds, and we said they shouldn't do it. We liked our boxes. They made going to bed seem like an adventure. Shortly after we moved into the depot, Mom decided that what we really needed was a piano. Dad found a cheap upright when a saloon in the next town over went out of business, and he borrowed a neighbor's pickup to bring it home. We slid it off the pickup down a ramp, but it was too heavy to carry. To get into the depot, Dad devised a system of ropes and pulleys that he attached to the piano in the front yard and ran through the house and out the back door, where they were tied to the pickup. The plan was for Mom to ease the truck forward, pulling the piano into the house while Dad and we kids guided it up the ramp of planks and through the front door. "Ready?" Dad hollered when we were all in our positions. "Okie doke," Mom shouted. But instead of easing forward, Mom, who had never quite gotten the hang of driving, hit the gas pedal hard, and the truck shot ahead. The piano jerked out of our hands, sending us lurching forward, and bounced into the house, splintering the door frame. Dad screamed at Mom to slow down, but she kept going and dragged the screeching chord-banging piano across the depot floor and right through the rear door, splintering its frame too, then out into the backyard where it came to rest next day to a thorny bush. Dad came running through the house. "What the Sam Hill were you doing?" he yelled at Mom. "I told you to go slow." "I was only doing 25, Mom said. "You get mad at me when I go that slow on the highway." She looked behind her and saw the piano sitting in the backyard. "Oopsie daisy," she said. Mom wanted to turn around and drag it back into the house from the other direction, but Dad said that was impossible because the railroad tracks were too close to the front door to get the pickup in position. So the piano stayed where it was. On the days Mom felt inspired, she took a sheet of music and one of our spool chairs outside and pounded away at her music back there. "Most pianists never get the chance to play in the great outdoors," she said, "and now the whole neighborhood can enjoy the music too." Dad got a job as an electrician in a barite mine. He left early and came home early, and in the afternoons we all played games. Dad taught us cards. He tried to show us how to be steely-eyed poker players, but I wasn't very good. Dad said you could read my face like a traffic light. Even though I wasn't much of a bluffer, I sometimes win a hand because I was always getting excited by even mediocre cards, like a pair of fives, which made Brian and Laura think I'd been dealt aces. Dad also invented games for us to play, like the ergo game, in which he'd make two statements of fact, and we had to answer a question based on those statements, or else say insufficient information to draw a conclusion and explain why. When Dad wasn't there, we invented our own games. We didn't have many toys, but you didn't need toys in a place like Battle Mountain. We'd get a piece of cardboard and go tobogganing down the depot's narrow staircase. We'd jump off the roof of the depot using an army surplus blanket as our parachute and letting our legs buckle under us when we hit the ground. like Dad had taught us real parachutists do. We'd put a piece of scrap metal, or a penny if we were feeling extravagant, on the railroad tracks right before the train came. After the train had roared by, the massive wheels churning, we'd run to get our newly flattened, hot and shiny piece of metal. The thing we'd like to do most was go exploring in the desert. We'd get up at dawn, my favorite time, when the shadows were long and purple, and you still had the whole day ahead of you. Sometimes Dad went with us, and we'd march through the sagebrush military style, with Dad calling out orders in a sing-song chant. Hup, 2, 3, 4. And then we'd stop and do push-ups, or Dad would hold out his arms so we could do pull-ups on it. Mostly Brian and I went exploring by ourselves. That desert was filled with all sorts of amazing treasures. We had moved to Battle Mountain because of the gold in the area, but the desert also had tons of other mineral deposits. There was silver, copper, and uranium and barite, which Dad said oil drilling rigs used. Mom and Dad could tell what kind of minerals and oil were in the ground from the color of the rock and soil, and they taught us what to look for. Iron was in the red rocks, copper in the green. There was so much turquoise, nuggets, and even big chunks of it lying on the desert floor that Brian and I could fill our pockets with it until the weight practically pulled our pants down. You could also find arrowheads and fossils and old bottles that had turned deep purple from lying under the broiling sun for years. You could find the sun-parched skulls of coyotes and empty tortoise shells and the rattles and shed skins of rattlesnakes. And you could find great big bullfrogs that had stayed in the sun too long and were completely dried up and as light as a piece of paper. On Sunday night, if Dad had money, we'd all go to the Owl Club for dinner. The Owl Club was world famous, according to the sign, where a hoot owl wearing a chef's hat pointed the way to the entrance. Off to one side was a room with rows of slot machines that were constantly clinking and ticking and flashing lights. Mom said the slot players were hypnotized. Dad said they were damn fools. Never play the slots, Dad told us. They're for suckers who rely on luck. Dad knew all about statistics, and he explained how the casino stacked the odds against the slot players. When Dad gambled, he preferred poker and pool, games of skill, not chance. Whoever coined the phrase, "a man's got to play the hand that was dealt him," was most certainly one piss-poor bluffer, Dad said. The Owl Club had a bar where groups of men with sunburned necks huddled together over beers and cigarettes. They all knew Dad, and whenever he walked in, they insulted him in a loud, funny way that was meant to be friendly. "This joint must be going to hell in a handbasket if they're letting in sorry-ass characters like you," they'd shout. "Hell, my presence here has a positively elevating effect compared to you mangy coyotes," Dad would yell back. They'd all throw their heads back and laugh and slap one another between the shoulder blades. We always sat at one of the red booths. "Such good manners," the waitress would exclaim, because Mom and Dad made us say sir and ma'am and yes please and thank you. "They're damn smart too," Dad would declare. "Finest damn kids ever walked the planet." And we'd smile and order hamburgers or chili dogs and milkshakes and big plates of onion rings that glistened with hot grease. The waitress brought the food to the table and poured the milkshakes from a sweating metal container into our glass. There was always some left over, so she kept the container on the table for us to finish. "Looks like you hit the jackpot and got something extra," she'd say with a wink. We always left the owl club so stuffed we could hardly walk. "Let's waddle home, kids," Dad would say. The Barright mine where Dad worked had a commissary, and the mine owner deducted our bill and the rent for the depot out of Dad's paycheck every month. At the beginning of each week, we went to the commissary and brought home bags and bags of food. Mom said only people brainwashed by advertising bought prepared foods such as SpaghettiOs and TV dinners. She bought the basics: sacks of flour or cornmeal, powdered milk, onions, potatoes, 20-pound bags of rice or pinto beans, salt, sugar, yeast for making bread, cans of jack mackerel, a canned ham or a fat slab of bologna, and for dessert, cans of sliced peaches. Mom didn't like cooking much. "Why spend the afternoon making a meal that will be gone in an hour?" she'd ask us, "when in the same amount of time I can do a painting that will last forever." So once a week or so, she'd fix a big cast iron vat of something like fish or rice or usually beans. We'd all sort through the beans together, picking out the rocks. Then Mom would soak them overnight, boil them the next day with an old ham bone to give them flavor, and for that entire week, we'd have beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If the beans started going bad, we just put extra spice in them, like the Mexicans at the LBJ apartments always did. We bought so much food that we never had much money come payday. One payday, Dad owed the mine company 11 cents. He thought it was funny and told them to put it on his tab. Dad almost never went out drinking at night like he used to. He stayed home with us. After dinner, the whole family stretched out on the benches and the floor of the depot and read, with the dictionary in the middle of the room so we kids could look up words we didn't know. Sometimes I discussed the definitions with Dad, and if we didn't agree with what the dictionary writer said, we sat down and wrote a letter to the publishers. They'd write back defending their position, which would prompt an even longer letter from Dad. And if they replied again, so would he, until we stopped hearing from the dictionary people. Mom read everything: Charles Dickens, William Faulkner, Henry Miller, Pearl Buck. She even read James Michener, apologetically saying she knew it wasn't great literature, but she couldn't help herself. Dad preferred science and math books, biographies and history. We kids read whatever Mom brought home from her weekly trips to the library. Brian read thick adventure books, ones written by guys like Zane Grey. Lori especially loved Freddie the Pig and all the Oz books. I liked the Laura Ingalls Wilder stories and the We Were There series about kids who lived at great historical moments, but my favorite was Black Beauty. Occasionally, on those nights when we were all reading together, a train would thunder by, shaking the house and rattling the windows. The noise was thunderous, but after we'd been there a while, we didn't even hear it. Mom and Dad enrolled us in Mary S. Black Elementary School, a long, low building with an asphalt playground that turned gooey in the hot sun. My second grade class was filled with children of miners and gamblers, scabby-kneed and dusty from playing in the desert, with uneven home scissored bangs. Our teacher, Miss Page, was a small, pinched woman, given to sudden rages and savage thrashings with her ruler. Mom and Dad had already taught me nearly everything Miss Page was teaching the class. Since I wanted the other kids to like me, I didn't raise my hand all the time the way I had in Blythe. Dad accused me of coasting. Sometimes he made me do arithmetic homework in binary numbers. Sometimes he made me do arithmetic homework in binary numbers because he said I needed to be challenged. Before class, I'd have to recopy it into Arabic numbers. But one day I didn't have time, so I turned in the assignment in its binary version. "What's this?" Miss Page asked. She pressed her lips together as she studied the circles and lines that covered my paper, then looked up at me suspiciously. "Is this a joke?" I tried to explain to her about binary numbers and how they were the system that computers used, and how Dad said they were far superior to other numeric systems. Miss Page stared at me. "It wasn't the assignment," she said impatiently. She made me stay late and redo the homework. I didn't tell Dad because I knew he'd come to school to debate Miss Page about the virtues of various numeric systems. Lots of other kids lived in our neighborhood, which was known as the Tracks, and after school we all played together. We played red light, green light, tag, football, Red Rover, or nameless games that involved running hard, keeping up with the pack, and not crying if you fell down. All the families who lived around the Tracks were tight on cash. Some were tighter than others, but all of us kids were scrawny and sunburned and wore faded shorts and raggedy shirts and sneakers with holes or no shoes at all. What was most important to us was who ran the fastest and whose daddy wasn't a wimp. My dad was not only not a wimp, he came out to play with the game, running alongside us, tossing us up in the air, and wrestling against the entire pack without getting hurt. Kids from the Tracks came knocking at the door when I answered. They asked, "Can your dad come out and play?" Lori, Brian, and I, and even Maureen could go pretty much anywhere and do just about anything we wanted. Mom believed that children shouldn't be burdened with a lot of rules and restrictions. Dad whipped us with his belt, but never out of anger, and only if we backtalked or disobeyed a direct order, which was rare. The only rule was that we had to come home when the street lights went on. "And use your common sense," Mom said. She felt it was good for kids to do what they wanted because they learned a lot from their mistakes. Mom was not one of those fussy mothers who got upset when you came home dirty or played in the mud or fell and cut yourself. She said people should get things like that out of their systems when they were young. Since an old nail ripped my thigh when I was climbing over a fence at my friend Carla's house. Once, an old nail ripped my thigh while I was climbing over a fence at my friend Carla's house. Carla's mother thought I should go to the hospital for stitches and a tetanus shot. "Nothing but a minor flesh wound," Mom declared after studying the deep gash. "People these days run to the hospital every time they skin their knees," she added. "We're becoming a nation of sissies." With that, she sent me back out to play. Some of the rocks I found while I was exploring out in the desert were so beautiful that I could not bear the idea of leaving them there. So I started a collection. Brian helped me with it, and together we found garnets and granite and obsidian and Mexican crazy lace and more turquoise. Dad made necklaces for Mom out of all that turquoise. We discovered large sheets of mica that you could pound into powder and then rub all over your body so you'd shimmer under the Nevada sun as if you were coated with diamonds. Lots of times Brian and I thought we'd found gold and we'd stagger home with an entire bucket full of sparkling nuggets, but it was always our iron pyrite, fool's gold. Some of it, Dad said we should keep because it was especially good quality for fool's gold. My favorite rocks to find were geodes, which Mom said came from the volcanoes that had erupted to form the Tuscarora Mountains millions of years ago. during the Miocene period. From the outside, geos looked like boring round rocks, but when you broke them open with a chisel and hammer, the insides were hollow, like a cave, and the walls were covered with glittering white quartz crystals or sparkling purple amethysts. I kept my rock collection behind the house, next to Mom's piano, which was getting a little weathered. Laurie and Brian and I would use the rocks to decorate the graves of our pets that had died or of the dead animals we found and decided should get a proper burial. I also held rock sales. I didn't have that many customers because I charged hundreds of dollars for a piece of flint. In fact, the only person who ever bought one of my rocks was Dad. He came out behind the house one day with a pocket full of change and was startled when he saw the price tags I'd taped to each rock. "Honey, your inventory might move a little faster if you drop your prices," he said. I explained that all my rocks were incredibly valuable, and I'd rather keep them than sell them for less than they were worth. Dad gave me his crooked smile. "Sounds like you've thought this through pretty well," he said. He told me he had his heart set on buying a particular piece of rose quartz, but didn't have the $600 I was charging. So I cut the price to $500 and let him have it on credit. Brian and I loved to go to the dump. We looked for treasures among the discarded stoves and refrigerators, the broken furniture, and stacks of bald tires. We chased after the desert rats that lived in the wrecked cars, or caught tadpoles and frogs in the scum-topped pond. Buzzards circled overhead, and the air was filled with dragonflies the size of small birds. There were no trees to speak of in Battle Mountain, but one corner of the dump had huge piles of railroad ties and rotten lumber that were great for climbing and carving your initials on. We called it the woods. Toxic and hazardous waste was stored in another corner of the dump where you could find old batteries, oil drums, paint cans, and bottles with skulls and crossbones. Brian and I decided some of this stuff would make for a neat scientific experiment. So we filled up a couple of boxes with different bottles and jars and took them to an abandoned shed we named our laboratory. At first we mixed things together, hoping they would explode, but nothing happened. So I decided we should conduct an experiment to see if any of the stuff was flammable. The next day after school, we came back to the laboratory with a box of Dad's matches. We unscrewed the lids of some of the jars, and I dropped in matches. But still, nothing happened. So we mixed up a batch of what Brian called nuclear fuel, pouring different liquids into a can. When I tossed in the match, a cone of flame shot up with a whoosh like a jet afterburner. Brian and I were knocked to our feet. When we stood up, one of the walls was on fire. I yelled to Brian that we had to get out of there, but he was throwing sand at the fire, saying that we had to put it out or we'd get in trouble. The flames were spreading toward the door, eating up that dry old wood in no time. I kicked out a board in the back wall and squeezed through. When Brian didn't follow, I ran up the street calling for help. I saw Dad walking home from work. We ran back to the shack. Dad kicked in more of the wall and pulled Brian out coughing. I thought Dad would be furious, but he wasn't. He was sort of quiet. We stood on the street watching the flames devour the shack. Dad had an arm around each of us. He said it was an incredible coincidence that he happened to be walking by. Then he pointed to the top of the fire, where the snapping yellow flames dissolved into an invisible shimmery heat that made the desert beyond seem to waver like a mirage. Dad told us that zone was known in physics as the boundary between turbulence and order. It's a place where no rules apply, or at least they haven't figured them out yet, he said. You all got a little too close to it today. None of us kids got allowances. When we wanted money, we walked along the roadside, picking up beer cans and bottles that we redeemed for 2 cents each. Brian and I also collected scrap metal that we sold to the junk dealer for a penny a pound, 3 cents a pound for copper. After we redeemed the bottles or sold the scrap metal, we walked into town to the drugstore next door to the Owl Club. There were so many rows and rows of delicious candies to choose from that we spent an hour trying to decide how to spend the 10 cents we'd each made. We'd pick a piece of candy, and then, as we got ready to pay for it, changed our minds and pick another piece until the man who owned the store got mad and told us to stop fingering all his candy and make a purchase and get out. Brian's favorite was the giant sweet tart candies, which he licked until his tongue was so raw it bled. I loved chocolate, but it was gone too quickly, so I usually got a sugar daddy, which lasted practically half the day, and always had a funny poem printed in pink on the stick, like, "To keep your feet from falling asleep, wear loud socks, they can't be beat." On our way back from the candy store, Brian and I liked to spy on the Green Lantern, a big, dark greenhouse with a sagging porch right near the highway. Mom said it was a cat house, but I never saw any cats there. Only women wearing bathing suits or short dresses who sat or lay out on the porch, waving at cars as they drove by. There were Christmas lights over the door all year round, and Mom said that was how you could tell it was a cat house. Cars would stop in front, and men would get out and duck inside. I couldn't figure out what went on at the Green Lantern, and Mom refused to discuss it. She would say only that bad things happened there, which made the Green Lantern a place of irresistible mystery to us. Brian and I would hide behind the sagebrush across the highway. Brian and I would hide behind the sagebrush across the highway, trying to peer inside the front door when someone went in or out. But we could never see what was going on. A couple of times we sneaked up close and tried to look in the windows, but they were painted black. Once a woman on the porch saw us in the brush and waved to us, and we ran away shrieking. One day, when Brian and I were hiding in the sagebrush spying, I double-dared him to go talk to the woman lying out on the porch. Brian was almost 6 by then, a year younger than me, and wasn't afraid of anything. He hitched up his pants, handed me his half-eaten sweet tart for safekeeping, walked across the street, and went right up to the woman. She had long black hair. Her eyes were outlined with black mascara, thick as tar, and she wore a short blue dress printed with black flowers. She had been lying on her side on the porch floor, her head propped up on one arm, but when Brian walked up to her, she rolled over on her stomach and rested her chin on her hand. From my hiding place, I could see that Brian was talking with her, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then she reached out a hand to Brian. I held my breath to see what this woman who did bad things inside the Green Lantern was going to do to him. She put her hand on his head and ruffled his hair. Grown-up women always did that to Brian because his hair was red and he had freckles. It annoyed him. He usually swatted their hands away, but not this time. Instead, he stayed and talked with the woman for a while. When he came back across the highway, he didn't look scared at all. What happened? I asked. Nothing much, Brian said. What did you talk about? I asked her what goes on inside the Green Lantern, he said. Really? I was impressed. What did she say? Nothing much, he said. She told me that men came in and the women there were nice to them. Oh, I said. Anything else? No, Brian said. He started kicking at the dirt like he didn't want to talk about it anymore. She was kind of nice, he said. After that, Brian waved to the women on the porch of the Green Lantern, and they smiled real big and waved back. But I was still a little afraid of them. Our house in Battle Mountain was filled with animals. They came and went, stray dogs and cats, their puppies and kittens, non-poisonous snakes, and lizards and tortoises we caught in the desert. A coyote that seemed pretty tame lived with us for a while, and once Dad brought home a wounded buzzard that we named Buster. He was the ugliest pet we ever owned. Whenever we fed Buster scraps of meat, he turned his head sideways and stared at us out of one angry-looking yellow eye. Then he'd scream and frantically flap his good wing. I was secretly glad when his hurt wing healed and he flew away. Every time we saw buzzards circling overhead, Dad would say that he recognized Buster among them and that he was coming back to thank us. But I knew Buster would never ever consider returning. That buzzard didn't have an ounce of gratitude in him. We couldn't afford pet food, so the animals had to eat our leftovers, and there usually wasn't much. If they don't like it, they can leave, said Mom. Just because they live here doesn't mean I'm going to wait on them hand and foot. Mom told us that we were actually doing the animals a favor by not allowing them to become dependent on us. That way, if we ever had to leave, they'd be able to get by on their own. Mom liked to encourage self-sufficiency in all living creatures. Mom also believed in letting nature take its course. She refused to kill the flies that always filled the house. She said they were nature's food for the birds and lizards, and the birds and lizards were food for the cats. Kill the flies and you starve the cats, she said. Letting the flies live, in her view, was the same as buying cat food, only cheaper. One day I was visiting my friend Carla when I noticed that her house didn't have any flies. I asked her mother why. She pointed toward a shiny gold contraption dangling from the ceiling, which she proudly identified as a shell no-pest strip. She said it could be bought at the filling station and that her family had one in every room. The no-pest strips, she explained, released a poison that killed all the flies. What do your lizards eat? I asked. We don't have any lizards either, she said. I went home and told Mom we needed to get a no-pest strip like Carla's family, but she refused. If it kills the flies, she said, it can't be very good for us. Dad bought a souped-up old Ford Fairlane that winter, and one weekend, when the weather got cold, he announced that we were going swimming at the Hot Pot. The Hot Pot was a natural sulfur spring in the desert north of town, surrounded by craggy rocks and quicksand. The water was warm to the touch and smelled like rotten eggs. It was so full of minerals that rough, chalky excrustations had built up along the edges. It was so full of minerals that rough, chalky incrustations had built up along the edges, like a coral reef. Dad was always saying we should buy the Hot Pot and develop it as a spa. The deeper you went into the water, the hotter it got. It was very deep in the middle. Some people around Battle Mountain said the hot pot had no bottom at all, that it went clean through to the center of the earth. A couple of drunks and wild teenagers had drowned there, and people at the Owl Club said when their bodies floated back to the surface, they'd been literally boiled. Both Brian and Laurie knew how to swim, but I had never learned. Large bodies of water scared me. They seemed unnatural oddities in the desert towns where we'd live. We'd had once stayed at a motel with a swimming pool, and I worked up enough nerve to make my way around the entire length of the pool, clinging to the side. But the hot pot didn't have any neat edges like that swimming pool. There was nothing to cling to. I waded in up to my shoulders. The water around my chest was warm, and the rocks I was standing on felt so hot I wanted to keep moving. I looked back at Dad, who watched me unsmiling. I tried to push out into the deep water, but something held me back. Dad dived in and splashed his way toward me. "You're going to learn to swim today," he said. He put an arm around me and we started across the water. Dad was dragging me. I felt terrified and clutched his neck so tightly that his skin turned white. That wasn't so bad, was it?" Dad asked when we got to the other side. We started back, and this time when we got to the middle, Dad pried my fingers from around his neck and pushed me away. My arms flailed around and I sank into the hot, smelly water. I instinctively breathed in. Water surged into my nose and mouth and down my throat. My lungs burned. My eyes were open, the sulfur stinging them, but the water was dark and my hair was wrapped around my face. I couldn't see anything. A pair of hands grabbed me around the waist. Dad pulled me into the shallow water. I was spitting and coughing and breathing in uneven choking gasps. "That's okay," Dad said. "Catch your breath." When I recovered, Dad picked me up and heaved me back into the middle of the hot pot. "Sink or swim," he called out. For the second time I sank. The water once more filled my nose and lungs. I kicked and flailed and thrashed my way to the surface, gasping for air, and reached out to Dad. But he pulled back, and I didn't feel his hands around me until I'd sunk one more time. He did it again and again until the realization that he was rescuing me only to throw me back into the water took hold. And so, rather than reaching for Dad's hands, I tried to get away from them. I kicked at him and pushed away through the water with my arms, and finally, I was able to propel myself beyond his grasp. "You're doing it, baby!" Dad shouted. "You're swimming!" I staggered out of the water and sat on the calcified rocks, my chest heaving. Dad came out of the water too and tried to hug me, but I wouldn't have anything to do with him or with Mom, who'd been floating on her back as if nothing were happening, or with Brian and Laurie, who gathered around and were congratulating me. Dad kept telling me that he loved me, that he never would have let me drown, but you can't cling to the side your whole life. That one lesson every parent needs to teach a child is, if you don't want to sink, you better figure out how to swim. What other reason, he asked, would possibly make him do this? Once I got my breath back, I figured he must be right. There was no other way to explain it.